So you're interested in buying a Mini? With over 5.3 million Minis made since they first came out in 1959, it might be kind of daunting to try to find one. Here's a brief buyer's guide to help you find the right Mini to suit you. The first thing we're going to look at is specs. Because the Minis were made from 1959 till 2000, there is a ton of different options both for engine sides, transmissions, exterior options. So before you go to look at a Mini, you need to decide what kind of Mini you want. Now the Minis came out in 1959 with an 848cc engine that grew throughout the years all the way to 1275 with many different variants in between. The bigger the engine, the more powerful the car. For modern road traffic, it's usually recommended to get the biggest engine you can. However, if you're looking for a more vintage motoring experience or you want to try to find a car that's a little bit reduced cost, you can usually look for something with like a 998 or even the smaller 850cc engines. The Minis also came with both automatic and manual transmissions. It is worth noting, if you are looking for an automatic Mini, that the engine block is actually different on the automatics, so you won't be able to convert later to a manual without changing the whole engine. It's also worth noting that on the automatic Minis, like the manual, they share the engine transmission oil as one. And because of this, if they're not serviced regularly, little bits can get inside the small passageways of the automatic and make it not shift properly. So if you are looking for an automatic, make sure it was one that was serviced regularly. Minis also came both carbureted and fuel injected. The early carbureted cars are great for someone who is looking for a car that they can either work on themselves, learn to tinker with, or if you're doing performance upgrades, the carburetors are great because you can tune to make up for different mods you do to the cars. Also, there's way more room inside a carbureted engine bay, way easier to work on things yourself as compared to the later cars that were fuel injected. With Minis, they went all the way up until they came with air conditioning, power brakes, fuel injection, as you can see on this later Japanese SPI, standing for single point injection. Also, you can see way less room, way harder to get to things, much more cumbersome when it comes to working on things yourself. However, with the fuel injected models, they are a much more turnkey car, and if you're used to driving a more modern vehicle and you're going back to a Mini, this will feel a lot more akin to a modern car compared to the earlier carbureted versions. Minis also came both left-hand drive and right-hand drive, so depending on where you are and what your preference is, that is also an option to keep in consideration. Now that you've decided the specs of the Mini you want to buy, we can go see it in person. First and most important thing to look for when you're looking at a Mini in person is to check out the chassis. Minis rust. When I go to see a car in person and when I'm looking for rust, where I'll typically look is the key areas that I find. So that includes where the front subframe bolts up to the bulkhead here, also down on the A panel here and underneath the floor. A lot of people tend to put a jack underneath when they don't know how to properly lift the Mini, and that can crack the paint and cause rust underneath here. Minis also tend to rust on the bottom of the door, so you want to open up the door and take a look underneath. Another common area that Minis can rust is right here. It's called the heel board. This is where the rear subframe meets the floor, and because it's hard to see, this area can often be overlooked. After you've checked out the chassis and made sure that's in good condition, we want to check on the powertrain. That's the next most valuable and most expensive thing to repair if it's not in good condition. Whenever I'm looking at a car, first thing I'll do is just make sure that everything is in good working order. You want to start up the car when it's cold, make sure it idles nice, make sure there's no smoke coming out the back. You want to make sure that all the plug leads are in good condition, make sure that's not leaking anything. Mini engines tend to leak oil, so a little bit of oil leaking is not a big concern, but a giant puddle underneath the engine will be. Just go through it and make sure that everything looks like it's well cared for. All these parts are available, but again, you want to make sure that you're doing the least amount of work possible when you do get your car. The next most critical thing to look at in the car is the suspension and brakes. Some Minis came with what's called a hydroelastic suspension, but most commonly is what's called a rubber cone suspension. This means that there's a rubber cone that acts as the spring on all four corners, And because it's made of rubber, it can actually wear out over time, and the suspension cone can slowly start to compress, and you lose your suspension travel and the car becomes lower and lower. You can tell this because when you look at the car, it'll be sitting right on the bump stops. If it's completely compressed, the ride will be really bumpy. However, if you look at a car that's been lowered and it rides really nice, there's a chance it has something called a high-low suspension kit. This is essentially an adjustable trumpet that goes in between the cone and the upper control arm, and this can adjust your ride. These are an aftermarket upgrade, so if the car is lowered, it doesn't necessarily mean that the suspension cone is collapsed. It could just have an adjustable kit on it, and that's something to look out for. Because the Minis were one of the very first transversely mounted front-wheel drive cars, meaning the engine goes sideways and it powers obviously the front wheels, there's a lot of load that's put into the front suspension, and because of this, they're very hard on front suspension components. This includes ball joints. So one of the main things that I always check when you're looking at a car is just lift the front end up, and you want to grab the top and the bottom of the tire and rock it backwards and forwards. You can see this one has a little bit of play, and it should have zero play. So if you feel any knocking backwards and forwards, that usually means that the ball joints need replacement. If you go side to side and you feel a slight bit of play, as well as up and down, it could mean that the wheel bearing needs replacement. Now, these Minis are hard on both ball joints and wheel bearings, as well as the suspension bushings underneath. So just take a look at everything in there. That's a common wear item and definitely something to pay attention to. While you're looking at the suspension, it's a good idea to check the TC rod, tie rod. It's the suspension component that runs right here. This is a common area where it can bend if the car has been in an accident or the car has been lifted improperly. Not the end of the world if it is, but if you do notice that there's a bend in that rod, it's a good bargaining point when you're looking at buying one. For checking the rear suspension, it's very similar to the front. Jack it up so that the tire is off the ground, grabbing from top and the bottom of the tire, just rock it backwards and forwards. If you feel any clicking here, it usually means that the rear swing arm, the bushings in there, need to be replaced. These can be fairly expensive because the bushings need to be pressed in and then reamed with a special tool that you'd have to get done at a machine shop. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. If you notice that from side to side it's moving as well, it could be the wheel bearing in the center. That's much cheaper and much easier to do. Definitely something to pay attention to though when you're looking at the suspension of a Mini. When it comes to brakes, we've covered it before in other videos, but one thing to mention, if you want to run 10-inch wheels, you got to make sure that you have the right brakes to fit those. The 10-inch wheel is a very iconic Mini thing. In order to run it, you need to either have the drum brakes, the 7-inch discs, or the 7.5-inch discs. If you use a car that has the later 8.4-inch discs, it will not fit on with a 10-inch wheel. When Minis first came out, they had non-power assisted or non-servo brakes. These brakes stop the car excellently, however you have to get used to the rather firm pedal feel that these brakes have. The later cars, however, came with boosted brakes, power assisted. If you're looking for a more contemporary driving feel, this is what you want to look for. Last on our list is accessories. Now we've assembled 7 Minis here, and as you can see, not a single one looks alike. You'll find this throughout the range of Minis. There's so many different accessories and different options that came with the cars that it's really up to personal preference. It's not a determining factor whether or not you're going to buy a particular car because it has one sort of headlight or another set of mirrors, because all this stuff you can change and modify yourself, and that's one of the great joys of owning these cars. There is a ton of different options. Every component pretty much you can buy brand new. You can do it all rather economically. They aren't very expensive for different parts, and you can customize it to match your personality and what you want the Mini to be. So if you've never driven a Mini before, you're in for a treat. They're one of the most fun cars you'll ever drive. When you go for your test drive, you want to make sure that you're not hearing any weird noises, both from the suspension or the engine. You want to make sure the steering is nice and tight. There's no wobble there, that the shifter goes directly into the gears. You want to make sure it goes through all the 4 gears, including reverse. You want to make sure the engine isn't knocking around. I like to accelerate and decelerate, come on and off the gas, and you'll feel a clunk if the engine's knocking back and forth. That usually means that the engine steadies need replacement. And just general feel of the car. You can usually tell when a car is well taken care of. It'll ride really nice. There's this misconception that Minis cannot be ever comfortable or quiet, and if tuned correctly, they can absolutely be very comfortable for daily driving. People often forget that Minis were quite often just a city car where people commuted them in every day. Now they've become somewhat of a classic, but it doesn't mean it has to be uncomfortable at all. One thing you want to do with any front-wheel drive car when you're test driving it is to check the CV joints. You do this by coming to a stop, turning the wheel full lock, and then driving in a tight circle. If you hear any clicking noise, that means that the CV joints are needing replacement. Just something to pay attention to. One thing that you may not be expecting if you've never driven a Mini before is all the attention you get. Definitely not the car for the introvert. Minis are super fun to drive. They handle amazing. Make sure to take it through some corners and really get a feel for how they drive. They're the most akin to driving a go-kart on the street that you can get from any car, right down to its hilarious driving position with this big chunky steering wheel right between your legs and kind of sitting over top of the pedals. It totally reminds you of a go-kart. Even with stock suspension, stock seats, and tiny little 165 section tires, you'd be amazed at what these cars can do in the corners. And despite handling like a sports car, it's amazing because the classic Mini also seats 4 comfortably. In summary, you want to make sure that your chassis is in good condition, relatively rust-free, that your engine is the correct choice, both with its size and the transmission, and make sure that everything is in good running order. You don't have to be afraid about buying a Mini. They can be very reliable if serviced correctly, and there's a ton of information and wealth of help out there. There's a great community of people who are into these cars, and it's one of the best bang for buck motoring experiences you can get in the classic car world.
For just $1 a day, you too can play a big part in these Minis' lives.
This Mini here has not even real paint, no windshield. It was once a running car that someone loved.